last video, I concluded that in the search for answers to the big questions, either we allow supernatural explanations or we insist on natural ones. The supernatural ones are generally anti or pre-scientific, and they include a belief in the literal biblical account on its own say-so, of course, which is no form of corroboration that would hold any credibility in any other connection. And ranges on to explaining hurricane disasters as being caused by God's displeasure at gay marriage, for example. And they require suspension of a rational expectation of cause and effect chains, predictability, and the laws of nature and physics at the whim of a deity or God. And if the underlying laws of the universe, and I don't just mean those that we currently think we've discovered, but if they can miraculously change, then any attempt to deduce them through inductive reasoning or logic and using the usual intellectual tools of science is pretty much pointless, because at any point someone from that camp can decide to opt out of the rational evidence requirement and reach for their favoured supernatural reasoning. The consistency, which is science's hallmark, is gone. And then on the other hand are people who look for natural, rational explanations and who believe that the universe is orderly and well-behaved and in principle knowable. Whether or not they are conscious that they are working with this assumption, this unproven assumption, I don't know. But it's a non-negotiable assumption. Its suspension would render their approach impossible. They can, of course, point to the great success that it can be reached this way, not as a proof, but at least as a corroboration. So, which of these approaches is correct? Which should we follow? Natural, secular, scientific, or supernatural, religious, and magical? It comes down to a take your pick. Either way, there's no provable position, but both are based on a metaphysical choice, a basic belief about the deep nature of reality. But it doesn't necessarily follow that they're equally unfounded. On examination and noting the universal component of human nature, that instinct to find answers, clearly one is self-consistent at least, and the other is self-contradictory. I mean, if you begin with the expectation or requirement that the universe has consistency and that there are patterns of orderliness to be discovered, then it makes sense to search for them. But there's little sense in searching if your metaphysics allows for the overturning of natural law on the whimsical say-so of some deity, even divinely motivated say-so. And yet for all this, science still should not be too complacent. It's a spectacular edifice science has built, but it's based not exclusively on empirical observation and hypothesis testing. The great motivating assumption that drives science forward is just as metaphysical as the assumption that there's a creator God behind things. It's the assumption that the universe is fundamentally lawful and that inductive reasoning about it is reasonable, that things will behave the same way repeatedly if subjected to the same treatment. For example, gravity will not make an exception and allow me to levitate to the ceiling, at least not in the presence of some objective witnesses. If this wasn't assumed, then scientific investigation would not really be worth the effort. So science should remember its own skeleton in the closet, even though it sets verifiability as the gold card membership requirement. It works by not requiring that of its most fundamental starting assumption, lawfulness. And there are other cracks in the edifice of science where metaphysical choice rather than unambiguous observation decide the issue. Even in that flagship theory of the 20th century, quantum mechanics. Very briefly, the notion of quanta was introduced by Max Planck just over a century ago to explain why his successful radiation formula was a successful radiation formula, when the classical radiation formula wasn't. The physical reality of quanta has been taken for granted ever since then, as quantum mechanics has grown more and more successful, but But now different hypotheses have made the foundational justification of quanta unnecessary. So the acceptance of quanta as a physical entity is no longer a necessary inference from observation. So its ontological status is more metaphysical than it is objectively provable. Another example is the Casimir effect, which is an observation of what could either be the ground state of the radiation energy field in quantum electrodynamics, or just a fluctuating electromagnetic field in classical electrodynamics. Both predict exactly the same result. These are completely incompatible models, and the choice between them comes down to a matter of metaphysical preference. The point is not which one it is eventually, but that physicists must, in the meantime, rely on a metaphysical preference to decide which direction to pursue. So in conclusion, I think that the way forward is more complex than either of these two positions. The search for ultimate answers is via rational, evidence-based inquiry. It is the way to make progress that doesn't fly down some blind alley of chaos or fantasy on the one hand, or cash in the precious gift of human intellectual rigour to some religious dictator, be it a book or an enlightened being. But for all that, the search cannot be a metaphysics-free zone. Between both poles of this particular duality is the Buddhist idea of the middle way. I think that this might well be the basis of a future epistemology. I've been a sympathetic skeptic for nearly 50 years and found that methods of justified knowledge found in secular Buddhism penetrates far further than any other approach that I've come across. On one hand, it's relentlessly anti-dogmatic. It says test everything personally, take nothing for granted, nothing on face value. And on the other hand, it has a respect for the deep truths that various supernatural entities are metaphors, I repeat, metaphors for. So from here you can see the direction, at least, that my future rantings are heading. So thanks for listening.